and all APRC study visit participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning and welcome to the second IADI APRC study visit. So the second IADI APRC study visit is entitling Enterprise Risk Management and Cybersecurity. Some might question why we choose this topic. So in recent years, digitalization has been massively expanding. And of course, it has become a hot topic in almost all aspects. But unfortunately, threats also lingers along with the digital development such as, you can name it, malwares, ransomwares, virus, and others. Interpol mentioned on its 2022 report that in ASEAN only, or Southeast Asia region, more than 3 million attacks occurred in 2021, with Indonesia experienced the highest number by around 1.3 million. And for your information, IDIC was not excluded from such threat. And as a matter of fact, it happened this year, but luckily, we managed to deal the issue independently. And it shows the importance of the strengthening on enterprise risk management and cybersecurity, which become our topic for today. Additionally, it is truly our honor to mention that the APRC study visit serves as the part of the G20 site events along the IDIC International Seminar. Let's give a big applause to that. And before kick-off, and now let's kick off the content. But first, it will be wise if we can understand about the basics first before we go to the meat and bone. Professor Iwan Jaya Aziz, IDIC Research Advisor and Professor from Cornell University and Universitas Indonesia, will deliver a keynote address about overview of enterprise risk management. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Iwan Jaya Aziz.
Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Mas Purbaya, Mas Didi, Lana, and the other leadership of Indonesian Deposit Insurance, and also the ex-leadership of the Indonesian Deposit Insurance, because I met some of them. Thank you for inviting me here, and it's great honor for me to be here, that I can share with you some of my opinions and views about the ERM, about the enterprise sort of risk management. But I'm sure all of you in this room are not only expert, but you are involved directly in day-to-day activities associated with ERM, whether it's directly or indirectly. So what I would like to highlight here is really mainly the challenges that unfortunately you have to deal with. Because as you know, risk is not something new. We all know in any undertaking, in any endeavor, when we are trying to achieve certain goal, in the journey, we always bump into certain unexpected event, which we call risk. And some of the risks are internal, that is more or less preventable risk. And I understand in the IADI, there's a list of guidelines about how to deal with that sort of preventable internal risk. And some of them are also strategic risk. Strategic risk means if the institution is trying to get something extraordinarily, for example, if you are trying to achieve higher than normal return, then you need to think about a strategic move. And for that, there's a lot of meeting, a lot of brainstorming that requires, I call it devil advocates. So one opinion may be countered by others and so forth, simply because you are trying to achieve something which is beyond normal strategy. But those are maybe internal, more or less internal risk. But it's really the external risk that is not predictable. Some people now these days like to use the term unknown unknowns, meaning that you don't know what you don't know, basically. And we all just gone through that period. I'm talking about COVID, the pandemic. That is unknown unknowns. And it goes without saying that that event itself, it's not, even though it is more health related, but it's not really confined to the health issues. It's spread to other sectors, including economics, including finance, and including banking sector. And eventually that is also the concerns of the deposit insurance companies. So the risk is not new. What may be new is really the type and the intensity of the risk. And that leads to, supposedly, an alternative and changing approach in looking at the ERM, the enterprise risk management. You know, as I said earlier, I read the IADI kind of, I would call it the characteristic or the features of the deposit insurance system. It's ranging from the principles, the framework, the core elements of it. For example, unlike just regular risk, when we are dealing with the sort of enterprise risk management, we are dealing with the multiple risks, because the whole idea is that how to make every single unit, every single department risk combined together so that the operational aspect of the institutions can be in such that it will be easier to reach the objective. So in other words, unlike the individual department risk, when we are talking about ERM, we are talking about the overall risk, the holistic, institution-wide. And that makes it more difficult than individual risk. But that requires also certain kind of effort, how to deal with such challenges. You know, one says that it used to be simple, but then getting more complicated, and then getting more complex. What's the difference between that? When things are simple, it's almost like, you know, turning on and off the light. Up is on, down is off. It's that simple. But when it is getting more complicated, there are so many elements inside the system, and that requires someone to put it together and see the holistic view. But unfortunately, things are going beyond that complication now. Now we are moving towards complexity. Now, what's the difference between complexity and complicated here? In the complicated system, there are many parts, but at least we know when we push one part, when we push one button, we know what's going to happen. So to some extent, it's predictable. But when things get complex, in complexity, still there are many parts. The focus is really on the interaction between those parts. And that leads to unpredictable outcome. Now, unfortunately, we are now living in a world with complexity, more than just complicated. For the deposit insurance system, that also leads to a major challenge in terms of understanding both the external and the internal risk. When we're talking about internal risk, as I said earlier, thank God the IADI has a set of principles that we can follow, including the important components of it, the lines of defense of it. So we all know it. In a way, that is a good news because it will help us to guide in our day-to-day operation, because it will be easier for you to conduct any activities if there's a guidelines, and the guidelines is there. But the bad news is that, as I said earlier, things are getting more complex, including one of the issues that I understand the meeting today and tomorrow is going to focus on, and that's the role of the cyber threat. You know, the way I see the role of the digital technology, on the one hand, it can be extremely useful because make things easier, more efficient, and faster. Any transaction can be solved faster and more easier, and to some extent also more transparent. But on the other hand, if it is not well managed, if it is not well regulated, it can pose a serious threat. Among other things is the cyber threat. But there are all kinds of other threats like illicit activities, fraud, and also for some of the policymakers, it may also provide the risk of loss of control, especially if it deals with the system of payment, because we all know that the society directly involved in system of payment almost every day. So if it is not well regulated and it is not well managed, that kind of a digital technology can pose a serious threat. So in a way, it's a challenge for IADI, for the Indonesian Deposit Insurance, and I believe also for other DIC, how to balance between the potential benefit that digital technology can provide and the threat or the risk that is posed by this digital technology. So in a way, that itself presents a problem. But what is more problematic is that what you are all dealing with is finance. I always believe that the financial sector is different animal than the goods sector. You know, in a goods sector, transactions can be done and solved easily and more transparently. If I'm selling something to Purbaya and he evaluates the things that I'm selling to him, and then we agree on the price, that's the end of the transaction. That's the end of the story. But if I'm selling him a piece of paper which is written IOU, I'm talking about bonds, for example. Today, I'm selling it for 100. Tomorrow can be 1,000, the value. That's what we call the asymmetric information. There's a huge deal of asymmetric information in finance, and that distinguishes it from the goods market. In the goods market, of course, there's some degree of asymmetric information, but it's very small. So when you combine the challenge that I mentioned earlier, plus the fact that what you are dealing with is really financial sector with this completely different animal, the challenge is enormous. And this is the reasons why, despite the fact that we know what is risk, so why are we discussing again about this? The risk has been exploding, and some of them are unpredictable. And that is the next point that I'm going to sort of highlight about the unpredictability of the risk. Who would have thought that the biggest economy in the world, I'm talking about the US economy, can fall just because of the tiniest financial market? I'm talking about housing market. The subprime, not even the entire housing market, the subprime, the tiniest part of the financial market. And problems in that tiny market brings down the world's largest economy. That is unpredictable to some extent. Of course, some argues that, oh, we already predicted because of the vulnerabilities and so forth. But overall, I doubt that anybody can make a clear prediction what's going to happen there. Then came COVID. Who would have thought there will be a pandemic like COVID, which has repercussions in every sector? As I said, even though it is a health-related sort of issues, but it touched upon many other sectors, including economics and finance. Then we have a series of shocks. And the shocks are disparate, but interrelated. As a result, what we are seeing now is what they call synchronized slowdown in the world economy. And you know better than I do, what does it mean for the financial sector? And what does it mean for institutions like deposit insurance? Because eventually it affects the banking sector. Series of shocks, multiple shocks. And the series of shocks, as I said earlier, is disparate but interacted. That may lead to situations where the whole is more dangerous than the sum of different parts. Again, this is the third issues that makes the challenge for any financial institution, including the IC, more sort of difficult. The next one is what happened with the global liquidity. The reason I'm picking up issue of the global liquidity because I understand one of the most important factors in any banking sectors, which eventually sort of the concern of the deposit insurance companies is really the liquidity. To what extent the liquidity sort of affect the banking sector. Now, if we go back to, let's say, 2005 or early 2000, all the way until 2010, the global liquidity was featured by what I call the bank-led flows. What I mean by bank-led flows is there's a lot of capital flows in which the protagonists are banks. And of course, when we are looking back at what happened in 2008, the most important protagonist at the time was European banks, because they are operating in the US, getting a lot of funding there, and then transfer that money to many emerging markets, especially in the housing and real estate sector, and the rest is history. And those banks have to deleverage. And when that deleverage occurred, that affects many of the banking sector in emerging markets. So that lasted until 2010. And then something happened in 2010. It's not so much the crisis itself. It's not so much the GFC itself, global financial crisis. But what really changed the global liquidity is the policy response to that crisis. And of course, I'm talking about ultra easy monetary policy in which the interest rate was pushed down as slow as possible. And I think, as I'm speaking now, there are still 5 countries in the world that adopted negative interest rate. On top of that, there is a massive asset purchase program, what they call the QE, quantitative easing. Those events, those policy response, changed dramatically the global liquidity. For many of the emerging markets, what they experience is massive capital inflows. Now, those who are worried about the potential repercussions of that did something. Example being Korea. I know because I was indirectly involved in how the Korean government trying to sort of change the maturity of those capital inflows. If it stays less than 1 year, they put some sort of levy. If it is between 1 and 5 years, certain amount of levy, and beyond 5 years, it's free. So the whole idea is that trying to make sure that that massive capital inflow are not posing a dangerous trend of reversal. Because we all know any reversal will create destabilization. That itself is already posing a problem. What kind of sort of monitoring that deposit insurance companies have to deal with? Because if we are just looking at the balance sheet at that very moment of many banking sectors, you don't find any problems. If anything, it's almost like a wash of liquidity. But behind that, there's a risk. And the early indication of that risk being materialized already occurred in 2013, which by now we know it's called the taper tantrum phenomena. The good news is at that time, there was no direct reversal in the policy in the US and the Europe. So interest rate was not really increased yet. QE was not really stopped yet. So that's why I personally considered the event of 2013 is a good early warning, early indication, with the hope that any regulators, any policymakers are aware that this kind of things can go even more massive, and that will create more destabilizing forces. And now it happens. I would say started with the end of 2020, right in the middle of the COVID. Even the BIS, we know BIS is the central bank of the central bank, already noted the debt has been unprecedented around the world. I'm sure some of you heard about the fear of the repeat of 1970s. What happened in 1970s? There is a massive stagnation, so slow growth and high inflation. What is different now than 1970 is that the fear of stagflation is there, but now with a massive amount of debt. That distinguishes 1970s and now. What does it mean for the future health of the banking sector? Now that requires meticulous and very careful monitoring by deposit insurance system. Another phenomena that is, it wasn't there in the past. So in a way, it's new phenomena. And this is what the IMF called it, the sovereign bank nexus. What do they mean by that? Well, we know during the COVID, many countries trying to sort of overcome the problem by asking the central bank to buy bonds, the government bonds. And some of those bonds were bought by the banking sector. So if you look at the balance sheet of the banking sector on the asset side, all of a sudden, the amount of the government bonds has increased. From the standard safety measure point of view, that is good. And that's the reasons why the capital adequacy ratio of many banks are pretty high because government bonds is considered non-risky. The problem is that if the current sorry state of the global economy continues, I hope not, but if this continues, that may affect the pricing of all the securities, including bonds. In fact, I'm pretty sure in all countries where you come from, you started to see the yields started to go up. And that translates into the lower value, the lower price of those assets in the balance sheet of the bank. And if that continues, that's what the IMF fear, what they call the sovereign nexus, sovereign bank nexus. Because what's happening in the banking sector at the end is almost like implicit guarantee that the government has to provide. So all this risk, of course, within the ERM, they have to deal indirectly. But what I'm saying here is that I think in the coming years, the portions of this external risk will be greater and greater. And that poses a major challenge to many of the deposit insurance companies. Let me close and end by, can you go to the last chart, please? Nope, yep. So this is, in a way, it's like what I'm trying to convey today, a summary. Okay? What we have here is a polycrisis. It's not just multiple of crises, but polycrisis. And implicitly with those crises, there's a growing challenges here. We thought that pandemic is almost over, but then we are hit by a series of crises from the war, from supply chain, all kinds of things. At the same time, many countries started to impose tight monetary policy because of high inflation. So all this is really posing conflicting kind of challenges, which is not easy to find the solution. And there is no single solution, by the way. There's not a single variable that you can deal with, that you can play around with, because it's a polycrisis. What about the digitalization, the cyber threat, and so forth? As I indicated earlier, the digital technology provides an opportunity to make the transaction easier, more efficient, more transparent, and definitely faster. And I think it is unwise for deposit insurance companies to preemptively shy away from the use of digital technology just because of the risk and threat posed by the digital technology. As I indicated earlier, illicit activities, fraud, loss of control, and so forth. Of course, we need to deal with those crises rather than staying away from the use of digital technology. We heard from the chairman Purbaya earlier about how even Indonesian deposit insurance system is already attacked by some hackers. But that itself should not stop any DIC to continue using and exploring the use of the digital technology. And last but not least is, given all the threats and risks that I was presenting, the last thing you should do is being complacent. I know for several years, things are relatively easy to handle. But in the coming years, it will be a huge test for any deposit insurance companies because of the risks and all the uncertainty that I indicated earlier. So as I wrote there, the financial institution and regulators, including the DIC, should guard against the temptation to become complacent about the internal risks. How? By improving the program operation given the daunting challenges that I mentioned earlier. Let me close by mentioning some good news. For many DIC, the good news is that there has been some guidelines. So in other words, you are no need to search for any direction, any guidelines. The guideline has been given there. Another thing is that there is a room or avenue for sharing experience among DICs. And maybe IADI can help sort of facilitating that kind of sharing of the experience. Last but not least, the good news is that, as I indicated earlier, digital technology can help regulators. For example, I'm just thinking about one example. Under the digital technology, now many numbers are digitized. That means it's written in the computer code. That makes it relatively more transparent and quick to absorb, quick to acquire by regulators, including deposit insurance companies. So from that standpoint, it provides room for more efficient and more modern applications of regulation and monitoring. So the good news is that there are some guidelines and some opportunity provided by the digital technology. Of course, the downside of it is that digital technology can lead to the cyber attack, can lead to the illicit activities, can lead to fraud, and last but not least, it can lead to out of control in terms of, for example, money supply. This is the reasons why many central banks around the world now has been actively discussing and exploring the use of CBDC, central bank digital currency. Let me stop there, and I really hope that this conference or that meeting for today and tomorrow will lead to some new ideas that can help stabilize the banking sector and the financial market in general. And thank you again for the Indonesian Deposit Insurance Company for inviting me here. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Professor, for your address. But please remain on stage, sir. And I would like to invite Chairman Purbaya Yudi Sadewa to come on stage and hand over a token of appreciation. Let's give a big applause. Okay. And after